So the topic that was given to me is on Philippine values and learning system. Actually, I received two titles, and you posted two titles. Now, this poster says Philippine values and learning system, but the other announcement that I found in your Facebook page is about Philippine learning and value system. So I think they're basically talking about the same thing, but I would prefer the second title because I could not talk about Philippine values in general because it's too broad. I think the values that you are interested in pertain to values related to learning. So that will be my focus. So, based on what I saw in your Facebook page about what this talk is all about, so I produced three objectives. First, of this discussion, first is to describe the Philippines' learning and value systems. So I'm using the plural form systems because I think there are different and various systems that are found in the country because we have so many cultures in the Philippines. But the focus is on pre-colonial times. Later, I'll talk about limitations of this talk. Second is to identify the manifestations of these systems that still exist up to the present. And thirdly, propose how to integrate lessons from the learning and value systems of our indigenous communities. So I think the the reason for focusing on pre-colonial times is seemingly there's a disconnect between the formal educational system that we have right now with the learning systems of our ancestors. And we want to look into that and what we could call from the past and use at the present. Unfortunately, that will be one of the limitations because there is so little that has been written about cultures in the Philippines during the pre-colonial times, especially about education and learning. But still, we could infer from the limited data that we have. Now, the third objective talks about indigenous communities because this is where traditional learning systems are still being practiced up to the present. Okay, as an anthropologist, I will be using this different data or sources of data for my discussion today. First is available archaeological records. I'm mainly referring to archaeological artifacts where we could infer on what learning systems were probably like in the past. One limitation, of course, is I could not discuss archaeological sites in situ. That means where they were actually found, because many of these artifacts that I'm going to discuss were retrieved not through systematic methods, but nevertheless, we could still infer on learning systems from these archaeological records. Second is historical documents. Again, one limitation that we are talking about pre-colonial times, but our sources will be Spanish accounts. When the Spanish arrived the Philippines, what did they see? And uh, so there could be some biases in this data, but still we could not neglect chronicles by Spanish accounts. The third will be folkloric literature, such as folk tales, songs, music, etc. And during the discussion, I will show to you how it can be used to interpret pre-colonial life in the Philippines. Fourth will be linguistic evidences, especially when we're talking about values. Values are very much interpreted through language. So I will use basically Tagalog terms and related to learning and related concepts. Lastly, ethnographic accounts. So this discuss about the ethnographic present. That means lifeways of our indigenous communities, where some learning practices could trace their origins from pre-colonial times. So let me start with values related to learning. So, a translation that I will use for learning in Tagalog will be Pagkakatuto. And related values, that means things that children and parents want to achieve for their children, will be concepts such as kaalaman. So nag-aaral ka para magkaroon ng kaalaman, nagbabasa ka para magkaroon ng kaalaman, katarungan, karunungan, dunong will be the root word, kasanayan, especially when we're talking about applied knowledge, applied skills, katalinuhan. Of course, the root words will be alam, to know, dunong, intelligence, sanay, skill, talino, again, with intelligence. So there would be related concepts to this one. First, let's go not to the second column first, but let us look, for example, at kaalaman. So the root word will be alam. And let us look at related terms such as alamin, makialam, pakialam. So once you know, you are encouraged to act. Makialam ka sa nangyayari sa lipunan. So knowledge is not just for knowledge's sake, but in order to act. And this is probably one beautiful thing about our language. It stresses on the active part. Uh, Let me go also to pagkakatuto. Of course, tuto will be the root word, and related terms will be katotohanan, tuto, totoo, katotohanan. So, alamin ang katotohanan, to know the truth, and not be influenced by fake news, for example. Kamalayan, or having consciousness. Kamulatan, awareness. Kabihasnan, the root word will be bihasa, which is a cognate of the words bahasa. In Malay, bahasa means language. In Tagalog, basa is to read. So being able to read and write makes you a civilized person, makes you skilled and knowledgeable. Lastly, the concept kalinangan, which is the Tagalog translation for culture. And the root word will be linang, something to instill, something to imbibe. So when we discuss about learning processes, we will know that socialization and culturation entails imbibing certain values to children and youngsters. Okay, so let us look at the evidences that we have. Okay, one area to look into will be the concepts of literacy, because this pertains to the ability of being able to read and write. And what is the archaeological data in the Philippines? The oldest artifact in the Philippines where we have writing is the Laguna copper inscription, which is dated at 900 AD. So you have here a picture of the Laguna copper plate. This is found in the National Museum. And as the name suggests, it was found in Laguna, more particularly in Bahay. Okay? Now, this is actually a document about uh, a loan that one person was already able to pay. So yung kasaysayan ng utang sa Pilipinas ay napakatanda na. 900 AD, meron tayong evidence ng utang. So this is a recording system. And why will people record? Actually, in the latter part of the Laguna Copper text, it says the grandsons, granddaughters, and grandchildren of this person who has a certain loan is no longer asked to pay because this person has already paid his debts. So it talks about posterity. It talks about people of succeeding generations familiar about the transaction that transpired. But this writing system is very, very much different from the Baybayin that we know, because 900 AD is too early in our history, and our knowledge about the Baybayin or the Philippine syllabary came much, much later, sorry. So this Laguna copper inscription was more related to the Sanskrit script. Now the Baybayin or the Philippine syllabary. So it's not an alphabet, it's not based on letters, but based on syllables. And the earliest evidence that we have is written on the rim of the Calatagan pot, found in Calatagan, Batangas, which is dated probably at around 1200 AD. We don't know the exact date because it was not dated through chronometric dating or exact dating, but through relative dating. Associated materials in the burial site in Calatagan are Chinese ware belonging to the Ming Dynasty, and the dating is from 800 to 1400 AD. So approximately this is 1200 AD. Some of the syllables are recognizable for those who are familiar with Baybayin. For example, in the lower portion, you have the syllable for ba. In the lower left portion, you have the syllable for ki. Okay, the ka with a dot or a comma on top. So some are readable, but the entire phrase or sentence, we don't know what it means. There are some theories trying to explain it, but I won't go into that. It just shows that there was already a form of Baybayin starting from 1200 AD and probably even earlier, found in the Philippines. We don't know also how prevalent this was because our earliest evidences are from Batangas and the later evidences are much, much recent. Let us jump to the Spanish period. The first book published by the Spanish in the Philippines is the Doctrina Christiana, which was published in 1593. So this is a book of prayers, book of sermons, published by Spanish friars. And what is interesting in this book, it was published using three texts. Spanish prayers, such as Ave Maria, El Padre Nuestro. So, but they are written in Latin script. Another part of the book will be prayers written in Tagalog language, but using the Latin script. So naandyan yung Ama Namin, for example. And the third part will be Tagalog language again, but using Baybayin script. So why will the Spanish bother of printing prayers using Baybayin? That means there's a sizable community of Filipinos who are able to read and write using the Baybayin. Okay. So the Spanish friars used the Baybayin in order to propagate Christianity. And we could see documents which are now found at the USQ archives all the way to the 19th century signatures using Baybayin. That means it was still persistent, but there's a decline in the use of the Baybayin and a gradual shift to the use of the Latin script because of the introduction by the Spanish. Now, what does Antonio de Morga say in his book, Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas? This was published in 1609, but chapter 8 of Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas talks about Philippine culture prior to the arrival of the Spanish. So it talks about 1500s and probably even earlier. So one entry from Morga, and I quote, he says, throughout the islands, writing is well developed through certain characters or signs resembling the Greek or Arabic, numbering 15 signs in all, three of which are vowels, which serve in lieu of our five vowels. The consonants are 12. With this and certain points or signs and commas, everything one desires to say can be expressed and spoken fully and easily, just like with our own Spanish alphabet. So why does Morga say it resembles Greek and Arabic? Well, actually, there are common origins of the Baybayin, of Sanskrit, and even Greek or Arabic. For example, if we go back to the syllable ba, which is an inverted heart, if you put it horizontally, it could be similar to a letter B because syllables have evolved to become letters. What is interesting in what Morga is saying is that writing was well developed and it was spread throughout the archipelago. Well, some people say this is an exaggeration, and probably they are correct because we know of some places within the Philippine archipelago where there was no writing system. For example, I have done field work in the Cordillera region. So this is a landlocked region in northern Luzon. There was no writing system prior to the coming of the Spanish. But for many coastal communities, there was indeed a writing system, and I'll point you the evidence later. And okay, so people could understand what is written based on this alphabet. He calls it an alphabet, but technically speaking, it's a syllabary because it consists of syllables and not letters. Okay, Morga continues to say, writing was done on bamboo pieces or on paper, the line beginning from right to left, as in Arabic writing. Almost all natives, both men and women, know how to write in this dialect, and there are a few who do not write it well and properly. So there were some illiterate persons as well. This language of the province of Manila is understood as far down as the entire province of Camarines. And of course, during the Spanish times, the entire Bicol region was part of the Camarines province, as well as other islands adjoining Luzon, where they do not differ very much from each other, except that in some provinces, the language is spoken with greater purity than in others. So merong mas puro, mas taal ang pananalita, merong iba na mas colloquial yung pananalita. So let us look at some interesting uh, things that Morga said. They used bamboo or paper. Now, because these are materials that easily decompose, so we don't have much evidence of artifacts that were written in bamboo. We have evidences in paper, and they are found in the USD archives, but these are already during the Spanish period. We have evidences of artifacts written on bamboo, but they are fairly recent. That is among the people of Mindoro and Palawan, such as the Mangyan and the Tagbanwa. Okay. Again, what is important in what Morga says is that this writing system is familiar to both men and women. So literacy was not exclusive to men. Unlike in other cultures, when it was relatively recent, when they allowed women to go to schools. But in pre-Hispanic Philippines, both men and women knew how to read and write. Okay, from Paterno, here is his evidence of writing systems in the Philippines. Although this was already published in 1890, but Paterno talks about writing systems in different parts of the archipelago and comparing each one. So I know you can't read all of them, but in the left column, it talks about Mangyan, Tagbanwa, Tagalog, Komintang, Bulacan, Itondo, Visaya, Pampango, Pangasinan, Ilocos, and then he compares these writing systems with those of the Asoka in India, Toba in Indonesia, Bugis also of Indonesia, Borneo, Java, Arabic, and Hebrew, looking at similarities. So I tried to map where these writing systems are located, and they are indeed found in many parts of the archipelago. So Pangasinan, Pampango, Bulacan, Tondo, Mangyan, Tagbanwa, Ilocos, Tagalog. Komintang is the old name of Batangas, of course, now a Tagalog-speaking area, and Visaya. Now you will say, but in Mindanao, there's no syllabic writing. Uh, in the northern parts of Mindanao, according to Ferdinand Blumentritt, Visaya was already spoken even upon the arrival of the Spanish. Now, for Moro areas, unfortunately, Paterno was not able to study it, but Kawi or Jawi script was prevalent, but it was a different form of writing, mainly similar to Arabic, but pronounced in vernacular. Okay, now where do these writing systems still exist today in the Philippines? I could not cover all of them, but let me give some examples. One is the Hanunoo Mangyan of southern part of Mindoro. Take a look. They write their poems, known as the Ambahan, on bamboo tubes and on bamboo slats. They use a stylus made of a knife, a metal stylus, and usually they use this to write poems. Okay, so this is a translation of an ambahan, one of the poems. Okay. Many of these are written by people sending love messages to their loved ones. For example, along the trail, they would inscribe graffiti using surat mangyan or mangyan writing along bamboo stalks because he knows that his loved one will pass by that route and will be able to read the love poems. So may hugot din ang mga hanunoo mangyan. Another Mangyan group of Mindoro is the Buhid, and they have a form of literature known as the Urukay, also poems, but you will see the scripts are quite dissimilar from those of the Hanonoo Mangyan. But they are also inscribed on bamboo tubes as well as leaves. The next one will be the Tagbanwa and the Palawan of Palawan province. I heard now it's 3 different provinces, but let's talk about Palawan Island. So this is the picture on the right is a lime container, lalagyan ng apog para sa pagganganga. And the picture on the left is a primer on Palawan and Tagbanwa syllabic writing published by the National Museum. So it is still being used and propagated today. Originally, it was more common among the Tagbanwa, but becoming less and less of use among the Tagbanwa, but more among the Palawan. Now, there is a different writing system in a particular municipality or cluster of municipalities in Bohol. This is the Eskaya script of Bohol. You will see it's a different form of writing based on pictures. They are pictographs. Look at the letter A, for example, very similar to the letter A that we know, but according to them, it is based on movements, body movements of people. The picture on the left is an Eskaya school because this form of writing is being institutionalized in some schools among the Eskaya. Now, some people claim that this is of recent invention, probably already during the contact period between with the Spanish. So you will see influences of the Spanish in the letters, such as there will be a letter H, which is of course the Spanish for letter H, and there would be a letter X, again, the Spanish letter X. Even if it is something recent and something invented, but still, I would like to emphasize that indigenous writing systems are not static, but they are alive and evolve through time. Okay, now a question that you may ask is, now, what was the institution for learning during that time? Do they have schools such as what we have today? Well, my answer is no. There is no evidence of formal schools as we know, where they have buildings, where children go to on a regular basis to learn. They did not have that. Of course, there would be some places where they did their learning, and many of these are ritual places. For example, among the Eskaya, they talk about a cave where people went to in the past in order to learn their writing. Now, they said they resorted to the use of this cave in order uh, to study secretly because the Spanish did not like them to learn their own language and writing system. We don't know whether that's true or not, but this is one data that we have. We also know that parents were our first teachers during pre-colonial times, such as what Dr. Jose Rizal said when he mentioned that his mother, Chodora Alonso, was his first teacher. Now, the picture that you have is a representation of Pepe Rizal and his mother, with his mother teaching him how to read and write. According to Rizal, he was 3 years old when he learned to read and write. Of course, this was already during the Spanish colonial period. Of course, this was not the Baybayin, but again, we could infer if this was practiced during the Spanish period, probably its origins existed even during the pre-colonial times when our parents taught their children how to read and write, as well as other values, other forms of knowledge from the household. Now, learning, again, was not instituted through formal systems, but through observing, participating, and doing. So this is learning by doing. So people emulated what their elders did, and then they continued the practice. For example, among the Kalinga of northern Philippines, if they have mass meetings, men, women, the elderly, as well as children will be present. And of course, the children, although they could not speak in public meetings, they could observe the discussions and they could imbibe the lessons that they get from these mass meetings. So it was a learning institution too, but maybe you cannot call it as a school. Now, for specialized types of learning, such as for learning certain crafts, learning certain rituals, there was a form of apprenticeship. For example, among the Mombaki of Ifugao, the Mombaki is the Ifugao shaman or the native priest. How could you become a native priest? You could either inherit being a Mombaki because your parents, particularly your father, is a Mombaki or your grandfather is a Mombaki. But a Mombaki could also choose his apprentice, and the apprentice learns how to heal, learns how to uh, say prayers using archaic Ifugao language, learn how to officiate rituals while he or she is still an apprentice. Okay, now anthropologists as well as psychologists use the term socialization to describe this process. Now, let me define socialization. Socialization, as defined by Kotak, is a term used by anthropologists and psychologists to describe the development through the direct and indirect influence of parents and others of children's patterns of behavior, attitudes, and values that conform to cultural expectations. For example, we know that feeding o yung pagkain is a biological trait because humans are animals, or belong to the animal kingdom, we rely on external sources of food. But what we consider as food is largely defined culturally. So our parents would tell the children, anak, wag mong kainin yan. Madumi yan. Okay? Anak, kainin mo ito kasi masustansya ito. O anak, kumain ka na ngayon kasi tanghalian na. Anak, wag ka muna kumain kasi mawawalan ka ng gana. So these are socialization processes. Our parents teach us the do's and don'ts of culture. Now, of course, socialization is not limited to parents, but extended to the entire kin group. So it is also the responsibility of the lolo, the lola, the tito and the tita, yung kuya, ate, to teach youngsters on proper behavior, proper ethics. And much later, now in the modern system, once they go to formal schools, socialization continues through the teacher, with the teacher being the second parent of children. The first parents, of course, are found in the household, but yung mga guro natin ang ating mga magulang sa ating paaralan. Now, what was learned in these informal schools? Okay. Now, anthropologists use the term indigenous knowledge. And let me define IK. Let me quote from Uluwishewa. According to Uluwishewa, indigenous knowledge is the local knowledge that is unique to a given culture or society. It is the basis for agriculture, healthcare, food preparation, education, environmental conservation, and a host of other activities. Much of such knowledge is passed down from generation to generation, usually verbally. IK is the knowledge that people have gained through inheritance from their ancestors. It is a people-derived science, and it represents people's creativity, innovations, and skills. So kung ngayon, meron tayong iba't ibang mga subject, meron kayong makabayan, meron kayong matematika, meron kayong agham, noon din, merong iba't ibang mga subject o asignatura. You learn about agriculture, you learn about healthcare, you learn about food preparation, education, environmental conservation, etc. But through socialization processes and an informal mechanism passed on from generation to generation, from our ancestors to our parents to ourselves, and then we pass this on to our children and grandchildren. Let me give to you some examples of indigenous knowledge by existing indigenous communities in the Philippines. My first example is Ivatan indigenous knowledge on typhoons. The Ivatan is an ethnic group found in the Batanes province. Now, the Ivatan of Batanes, we know that Batanes is frequently passed by typhoons. Several typhoons pass by Batanes on its way to Taiwan and to China. So it is a typhoon belt within the Philippines. In terms of knowledge, the Ivatan have different terms for different types of typhoons. While in Tagalog, there will be limited terms such as bagyo, unos, probably ipo-ipo, etc. Among the Ivatan, here are some examples. Anin, which is a cognate of hangin, refers to a strong destructive wind. Anin du van Veye refers to destructive winds that uproot trees. Adipogpog refers to a tornado without rain. Dipanchi refers to recurring heavy rain with strong wind. Nisu refers to a windy day but without rain, while Salawsaw refers to a windy day but together with rain. etc., etc. There will be other terms. Now, if the Ivatan knows various terms for various types of typhoons, of course, they will respond to these different types differently. Now, the Ivatan also recognize several omens that predict the coming of typhoons. And because of these omens, they already know how to act, how to mitigate, how to take refuge because of the coming typhoon. Some of these omens are the dutao, or the sea omen, where they see a rapid sea waves that go in a straight line. The du-araw omen, or the sun omen, where there is a changing hue of the horizon from yellow to brown to a darker color, o yung nagdidilim. Another omen will be the presence of thick clouds over Mount Iraya, which is, of course, the highest peak in Batan Island. Another omen is the presence of white-mouthed ants relocating their nest. So they're moving from their nest, going to another place. They're white-mouthed because they're carrying their food. So the ants know that there is an impending typhoon. Another omen will be cocks crowing in the late evening, around 10 in the evening. And another omen will be banana leaves curling and growing because of the change in the barometric pressure. So, because of these omens, the Ivatan already seek refuge in their houses and uh, gather or amass a stock of food for the duration. Now, the Ivatans have developed a cultural adaptation to typhoons. For example, they practice land fragmentation. You could see that in the picture. And there will be windbreakers between different farm lots where they use rutalau trees to act as windbreakers. They also practice multi-cropping. So once certain crops are destroyed by typhoons, other crops are still available for them to eat. They also practice multiple cropping. Now, the Ivatan have a preference for root crops. Unlike rice, which could easily be destroyed, the staple food of the traditional Ivatan before rice was introduced is the uvi. This is the purple yam, uh, which cannot be affected by a typhoon. The traditional houses of the Ivatan are made of stone and with thick cogon roofs and are sturdy to protect them from typhoon. We could go on and on about Ivatan stories. Maybe during the open forum, I could give you more. A second example is among the Subanun of Zamboanga. The Subanun are the indigenous people of Zamboanga Peninsula. And one study by Charles Frake shows that the Subanun have a complex system of diagnosis of illnesses. So one example that he gave is knowledge about skin diseases. The Subanun know 29 different skin diseases, and they are distinguished from one another through different symptoms. And again, how they are healed are done differently for each type of disease. Now, let me go to folklore as a form of learning. Folklore refers to the traditional beliefs, myths, tales, and practices of a people, and they are transmitted orally. It is the unwritten literature of people expressed in folk tales, proverbs, riddles, songs, etc. These stories are embedded with lessons intended for learning. So one example will be the alamat ng pagong at matching. So the picture on the right is a sketch by Dr. Jose Rizal himself. But the alamat is much older than Rizal because Rizal learned the alamat from his mother. His mother learned it from his parents, and so on and so on. So it was a pre-Hispanic legend that Rizal simply documented and drew. And we know we have certain moral lessons based on this alamat. Why it would be better to be a pagong than a matching in this particular instance. Folklore is also a medium for instilling environmental protection. For example, the concept of tabi-tabi po. So, pag may, siguro sa mga tagapakinig ngayon, kung merong jingle sa tabi-tabi, sasabihin muna nila, tabi-tabi po. In the past, the concept of tabi-tabi po was a form of pagpapaalam, again, the word alam, alam, kaalaman, sa mga ninuno o nuno. Kasi ang mga nuno sa punso ay mga ninuno. Nagpapaalam ka na pwede po ba munang gawin ito. So, cutting of trees was not indiscriminate. If you need logs to build a house, you have to seek the permission of spirits first. The belief in diwatas in the forest was also an example. So from Anito or Nuno, it became a Dewata. Now it's called an Encanto, such as Mariang Makiling. Nagpapaalam tayo muna. The balete tree as something that is sacred because it's the abode of spirits. Taboo areas among the Ivatan and taboos among the Agta, for example, the Agta of Sierra Madre, it's a Negrito group in that area, do not cut nara trees because it's taboo. Now, masasabi ninyo, teka, superstition lang yan. But through this superstition, quote unquote, people learn to protect their environment. Unfortunately, when we dismiss this folklore as superstition, walang habas na ang pagpuputol ng mga kagubatan. Hindi na tayo naniniwala sa mga engkanto. So wala na tayong takot na kalbuhin ang ating mga kagubatan. Okay. Folklore as also symbolic representation of certain types of knowledge. For example, si Malakas at si Maganda is a legend. It's a story. But we know there are many symbols found in this story. The bamboo tree as a symbol of Filipino resiliency. Kung saan man umihip ang hangin, nag-i-sway ang bamboo. The bird, yung tumuka sa kawayan, represents freedom. At kaya nga sinasabi natin, ibon mang may layang lumipad. And when the bamboo splits, malaya na si Malakas at si Maganda. The splitting into a V form, Malakas on the left, Maganda on the right, represents bilateral Filipino kinship. We trace our ancestry through both the father side and the mother side. And Malakas and Maganda as a concept of complementary pairs. Because in the West, sa isang study ni Claude Lévi-Strauss, isang French anthropologist, sabi ni Lévi-Strauss, sa Western society, meron silang concept of opposites, black and white, good and bad, tall and short. But in our society, what is emphasized is not opposites, but tambalan, complementariness. Si Malakas at si Maganda. Hindi siya si Malakas at si Pangit. Hindi siya si Malakas at mahina, okay, hindi si maganda at si pangit. So, ang emphasize, complementary pairs. Another example will be the Bahay Kubo. Siguro, pwede niyong kantahin ngayon ang Bahay Kubo. That emphasizes biodiversity and food self-sufficiency. So, dahil maraming halaman doon, sari-sari ang mga halaman, matututunan ng mga bata ang pagpapahalaga sa pagtatanim ng iba't ibang klase ng halaman. Hindi lang palay ang itinatanim, bagamat ito ang ating staple food. Pansinin, sa Bahay Kubo, walang palay. Ang meron, singkamas, talong, sigarilyas, mani. Ang emphasis is biodiversity. So this type of agricultural system depicts an early practice of Filipinos, which is Sweden agriculture or horticulture, pagkakaingin. Sa pagkakaingin, walang iisang crop na pinagpapahalagan. Hindi siya monocropping. Ang pinagpapahalagahan, iba't ibang klase ng pananim. It reflects native taxonomy. Sabihin niyo, walang logic yung song. Merong logic ang song. Bakit magkakasunod ang kundol, patola, upot, kalabasa? Because they are all gourds. Bakit magkakasunod ang bataw, sitaw, bataw, patani? Because they are all legumes. Bakit magkakasunod ang sibuyas, kamatis, bawang at luya? Because they are all used na panggisa or pang saute. So merong logic ang unknown author ng Bahay Kubo. It's a form of local taxonomy imbibed upon children, and children emulate, but not through a formal system. Now, since I have very limited time, it's almost 11, what are the existing learning system among indigenous communities in the Philippines? We have many examples na nagper-persist pa, such as School of Living Traditions, encouraged by the National Commission for Culture and the Arts. Unfortunately, the focus of the SLTs ay yung arts. Yun lang, ano, mga pagsayaw, paghahabi, pagkanta. Mangyan Heritage Center among the Hanunoo Mangyan continues to imbibe and preserve the writing of Surat Mangyan among the Hanunoo. Among the Manobo of Mount Apo, they have this cultural regeneration movement wherein children memorize their genealogies. So meron silang mga contest ng mga bata. Sino ang nagtatag? Sino ang unang-unang manobo? Sino ang ating ninuno? Tapos parang contest yun. Okay? Among the Badjaus, meron silang floating schools. Whenever they moor on atolls, they go to these schools and learn. And yung famous Lumad schools, ito yung picture ng isang Lumad school that is being continued by our brother Lumads in Mindanao. Okay, now this is my last slide. How do we integrate these indigenous learning systems to modern educational system? So my focus will be limited to learning systems, not the entire indigenous knowledge systems and practices. So there is a need for further research and documentation on indigenous learning systems across different ethnic groups in the country. We have to document best practices among these ILS models and share these experiences to other communities and schools. We have to look at positive experiences where there is a presence of an interface between the traditional ILS and the modern school system. I'm sure merong interface. Halimbawa, I know among the Kalinga, actually sa Tinglayan Kalinga, dito kinuha ng Department of Education ang good example ng using ng mother tongue-based multilingual education because they learn that children learn better using their mother tongue. There is also a need to defend Lumad schools because they are threatened coming from military forces and paramilitary forces. They are being branded as subversive elements. But actually, these schools teach children how to read and write, teach them about arts and sciences through processes that are culturally appropriate. And there is a need for greater flexibility in developing curricula, syllabi, learning modules, and reference materials at the local level while maintaining standard learning outcomes in the entire country. I know there is a problem within our formal educational system. For example, when we were uh, uh, advocating for the use of certain curricula that may be used by indigenous peoples, the comment of the DepEd is, but that still needs to be approved by the DepEd. And that is a very bureaucratic process. Now, my counter argument is, but this could be just a supplementary material. And the DepEd will still say, even supplementary materials need to be approved by DepEd. So it's a very bureaucratic system and there is no room for flexibility. I think standard learning outcomes should be there across different communities in the Philippines. What students, what children need to learn. But how they could learn this should be more flexible. So with this, I would like to end my slide. I know there's an open forum, but if our time is not enough, my email is there. It's ntcastro1 at up.edu.ph. And you could also subscribe at my YouTube channel. It's ncastro87 or Nestor Castro. Thank you very much.